I never thought wiping down tables at Carmelo's would end with my hand connecting to a woman's face, especially not her face. But I suppose that's how all the best disasters begin, with a moment so small and so perfectly ordinary that you don't realize you're standing on the edge of a cliff until you've already taken that fatal step forward into the abyss below. The restaurant had been unusually quiet that evening, the kind of weighted silence that settles over expensive establishments when the clientele is too refined to speak above a whisper, where the clink of silverware against fine china creates a rhythm more predictable than a heartbeat, and where people like me, the ones who serve, who smile, who fade into the background like wallpaper, are expected to be invisible, to anticipate needs before they're spoken, to exist only in the periphery of these people's glittering, important lives. I had been working at Carmelo's for nearly 2 years, ever since my mother's medical bills had consumed every penny I'd managed to save from my previous job, ever since I'd learned that pride doesn't pay rent and dignity doesn't keep the lights on. And in those 2 years I had perfected the art of disappearing, of becoming so forgettable that the wealthy patrons could say anything, do anything, treat me like furniture without ever once considering that I might have thoughts, feelings, or a breaking point that they were pushing closer to with every casual cruelty. She had walked in like she owned not just the restaurant, but the very air we were all breathing. Her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that demanded attention. Her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail that probably cost more to maintain than I made in a month. And draped across her shoulders was a fur coat that I tried not to think about too hard, because the ethical implications would have made me sick if I'd let myself dwell on them. Vittoria Constantine was irregular, though regular, suggested a frequency and predictability that didn't quite capture the way she descended upon Carmelo's like a storm system, leaving chaos and humiliation in her wake, always surrounded by an entourage of equally pristine women who laughed at her jokes even when they weren't funny and agreed with her assessments even when they were cruel. I had served her before, had learned to keep my eyes down and my responses to single syllables, had discovered through painful trial and error that she enjoyed finding fault, that she derived some twisted pleasure from watching people scramble to correct mistakes she invented, and that she particularly enjoyed targeting servers who showed even the slightest spark of personality or pride. That night, she had been in rare form, snapping her fingers at me like I was a dog she was summoning, her voice dripping with the kind of contempt that only comes from someone who has never known what it's like to need anything, to want something they couldn't have, to understand that not everyone in the world exists solely to cater to their whims and desires. I had brought her water, still not sparkling, exactly as she'd specified, and she had taken one sip, wrinkled her nose in distaste, and declared that it was clearly tap water, despite the fact that I had poured it myself from the bottle of imported spring water that cost more per ounce than my hourly wage. When I had politely assured her that it was indeed the water she'd requested, she had looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes, the kind that could assess your worth and find you wanting in the span of a single heartbeat, and told me that perhaps if I spent less time talking back to customers and more time actually doing my job, I wouldn't be stuck serving tables at my age. The comment had landed like a physical blow, not because it was particularly creative or even accurate. I was 26, hardly ancient by any reasonable standard, but because it was designed to wound, to remind me of my place, to put me back in the box where she believed I belonged, and I had felt something crack inside my chest. Some protective wall I had built around the part of me that still remembered what it felt like to have dreams, to believe that I was worth more than the sum of the indignities I endured daily. I had swallowed the response that wanted to claw its way out of my throat, had forced my face into that blank, pleasant expression that servers perfect over years of practice, and had turned to leave, to escape to the kitchen where I could breathe and remind myself that I needed this job, that my mother needed the insurance this job provided, that pride was a luxury I simply could not afford. But Vittoria hadn't been finished with me, hadn't been satisfied with the damage she'd already inflicted, and as I had taken those first steps away from her table, I had heard her voice rise just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. loud enough to ensure maximum humiliation as she announced to her companions that the help these days simply had no concept of quality or service, that it was tragic how standards had fallen, how people who should be grateful for any employment at all had somehow developed the audacity to have opinions, to speak when not spoken to act as though they were equals rather than servants. Her friends had laughed, that particular brand of tinkling, artificial laughter that wealthy women seem to perfect in finishing schools or country clubs, and I had felt my shoulders tense, my hands curl into fists at my sides, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn around, to say something, to defend myself against this casual character assassination. I should have kept walking, should have maintained that professional distance that had protected me for 2 years, should have remembered that people like Vittoria Constantine were untouchable, that they existed in a world where consequences were things that happened to other people, where money and connections could smooth over any transgression, any cruelty, any crime. But when I had heard her call me worthless trash, in that languid, bored tone that suggested she was merely stating an obvious fact, rather than deliberately destroying someone's dignity for her own amusement, something inside me had snapped with an almost audible crack, like a branch that had been bent too far for too long, finally giving way under pressure it could no longer withstand. I had turned around slowly, deliberately, my feet carrying me back to her table even as some distant, rational part of my brain screamed warnings that I was making a terrible mistake, that this moment of satisfaction would cost me everything, that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. She had been lifting her wine glass to her lips when I reached the table, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around the stem with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been denied anything in her entire privileged existence. And she had looked up at me with those glacial eyes, one perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched in a silent question that somehow managed to convey both surprise and disdain that I had dared to approach her again without being summoned. The words that came out of my mouth next were not planned, were not carefully considered, were instead the raw, unfiltered truth that had been building inside me for 2 years of swallowed pride and silent endurance. And I had told her, in a voice that shook with barely controlled fury, that perhaps if she spent less time compensating for whatever was missing in her life by belittling strangers and more time developing an actual personality, she might understand why people served her out of obligation rather than respect. The effect had been immediate and electric, the surrounding conversations dying mid-sentence as heads turned to witness what was clearly an unprecedented breach of the invisible but ironclad rules that governed interactions between the servers and the served, and Vittoria's face had transformed from bored superiority to genuine shock, her mouth falling open slightly in an expression that might have been comical if the situation hadn't been so catastrophically serious. For perhaps 3 seconds, we had simply stared at each other, her brain clearly struggling to process that someone from my station in life had not only spoken to her that way, but had done so in front of witnesses, in front of her peers, in a public setting where her reputation and social standing were on full display. Then her eyes had narrowed into slits of pure hatred, her face flushing with a rage so intense it was almost beautiful in its terrible purity, and she had stood up so quickly that her chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream, the wine glass still in her hand as she stepped toward me with murder written across every aristocratic feature. I had known what was coming, had seen the intention in her eyes a fraction of a second before she acted, but I hadn't moved, hadn't stepped back or raised my hands to protect myself, because some part of me wanted this confrontation, wanted the world to see what these people were really like beneath the designer clothes and practiced civility, wanted witnesses to the casual cruelty they inflicted on those they considered beneath them. The wine had hit my face in a cold, shocking splash that soaked through my uniform and dripped onto the pristine white tablecloth, the liquid running down my neck and into my collar as she sneered at me with a viciousness that transformed her beautiful features into something ugly and twisted. And then she had spoken, her voice low and venomous, calling me worthless trash again, adding that I should crawl back to whatever gutter I had emerged from and be grateful that she didn't have me arrested for assault, for daring to speak to her that way, for having the audacity to exist in her presence. And that was when my hand had moved of its own accord, my palm connecting with her cheek in a slap that rang out through the silent restaurant like a gunshot, the force of it snapping her head to the side and leaving a perfect red handprint blooming across her porcelain skin. And in that moment, in that single second of violence and release, I had felt a satisfaction so complete and so terrible that I knew immediately I would pay for it for the rest of my life. The restaurant had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that feels almost solid, that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the blood rushing through your veins like a countdown to inevitable disaster. And Vittoria had simply stood there, frozen, one hand slowly rising to touch her reddening cheek, her eyes wide with a shock so profound that it had temporarily overridden even her rage. That was when I had heard the door open behind me, the soft chime of the bell that announced new arrivals barely audible over the pounding of my own heart, and I had felt the atmosphere in the room shift in a way that made my skin prickle with instinctive warning, the kind of primal recognition that tells prey animals a predator has entered their territory. Every eye in the restaurant had moved past me to focus on whoever had just walked in, and I had watched Vittoria's expression transform from shocked rage to something far more complex. Fear mixed with relief, calculation mixed with vindication, and underneath it all, a smugness so thick I could practically taste it in the air between us. I had turned slowly, my hand still tingling from the impact, my uniform still dripping wine onto the expensive carpet, and found myself staring at a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire room, despite the fact that he had barely crossed the threshold, flanked on either side by men in expensive suits, whose posture and dead eyes marked them as exactly the kind of people you never wanted to encounter in a dark alley or, apparently, in an upscale restaurant where you had just slapped someone important. Damiano Constantine was not what I had expected, though I couldn't have said exactly what I had been expecting from a man whose name was whispered in certain circles with the kind of reverence usually reserved for natural disasters and acts of God, whose reputation preceded him like a shadow that swallowed light and hope and foolish young women who slapped his wife in public. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested violence held in careful check, his dark hair perfectly styled and his suit probably worth more than my car. But it was his eyes that had captured my attention and refused to let go. Dark and fathomless and fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like he could see straight through my skin to catalog every secret, every fear, every desperate choice that had led me to this moment. Those eyes had moved from my face to my wine-soaked uniform, to his wife's reddening cheek, and back to my face again. And I had seen something flicker in their depths, not anger, which would have made sense, but something closer to curiosity, to interest, to the kind of assessment a collector might give to an unexpected find at an estate sale. Vittoria had rushed to him immediately, her heels clicking against the floor as she pressed herself against his side, one hand still touching her cheek as she launched into a breathless explanation of what had transpired, her voice pitched to convey maximum distress and indignation, painting me as some kind of deranged employee who had attacked her without provocation, who had insulted her and then physically assaulted her in front of witnesses, who clearly represented a danger to everyone in the establishment. But Damiano's eyes had never left my face, had never so much as glanced at his wife as she performed her role of wronged victim with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, many times before. And I had felt something shift in the air between us, some unspoken communication that I couldn't decipher but that made every instinct I possessed scream warnings that I was in far more danger than I had initially understood. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to command absolute attention, that carried an authority so inherent it seemed to vibrate in the bones of everyone who heard it. And he had asked me, in that calm, almost conversational tone, whether I understood what I had just done, whether I comprehended the magnitude of my mistake, whether I had any concept of the consequences that would follow this moment of violence against his wife. I had wanted to defend myself, to explain that she had provoked me, that she had spent the better part of an hour systematically humiliating me for her own entertainment. But the words had died in my throat because I could see in his eyes that he already knew, that he had probably walked in on the tail end of the confrontation and had witnessed enough to understand exactly what had transpired, and that my explanations, my justifications, my very reasonable reasons for losing control would mean absolutely nothing in the face of what was coming. The restaurant manager had appeared then, practically materializing out of thin air, with the kind of speed that suggested he had been watching the entire scene unfold and had been trying to decide on the least damaging course of action. And he had immediately begun apologizing to Damiano and Vittoria in that obsequious tone that people use when they're terrified and trying desperately to avoid consequences, assuring them that I would be terminated immediately, that the restaurant would cover any medical expenses or damages, that this kind of behavior was absolutely unacceptable and had never happened before in Carmelo's long and distinguished history. I had barely heard him, had been too focused on Damiano's face, on the way his expression had shifted into something I couldn't quite read, something that looked almost like satisfaction, like he had been waiting for exactly this kind of chaos to erupt and was pleased that it had finally arrived. Then he had spoken again, cutting through the manager's desperate apologies with a single raised hand, his voice still calm and controlled as he informed everyone present that he would handle this personally, that the restaurant should not concern itself with my employment status or any potential legal ramifications, that this was now a private matter between his family and myself, and that we would be resolving it outside the public eye. The words should have been reassuring, should have suggested that perhaps he was going to be reasonable about the situation. But the way he said them, the dark promise underlying every syllable, had sent ice water flowing through my veins because I understood, in that moment, that I had not just slapped a wealthy woman having a bad day, I had slapped the wife of a man who operated entirely outside the normal rules of society, who had resources and connections and a reputation that meant he could make problems disappear without ever facing consequences. And I had just become exactly the kind of problem that men like him specialized in eliminating. As his men had stepped forward, moving with the practiced coordination of people who had done this many times before, who knew exactly how to escort someone out of a public space without causing a scene or drawing additional attention, I had felt my legs begin to shake, my earlier satisfaction and righteous anger draining away to be replaced by a terror so profound it threatened to buckle my knees beneath me. And I had looked one last time at Damiano Constantine's face, at those dark eyes that promised I had just made the worst mistake of my life, at the slight curve of his lips that wasn't quite a smile but suggested he was already thinking 3 moves ahead in a game I didn't even know I was playing. His final words to me, spoken so quietly that only I could hear them as his men took position on either side of me, had been simple and devastating in their complete certainty, delivered with the kind of confidence that comes from never being wrong, from always getting exactly what he wanted, from existing in a world where his will shaped reality itself. "I'll handle this personally," he had repeated, and then, leaning in just close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne and see the absolute lack of mercy in his eyes, he had added, "And when I'm finished with you, Isadora Morelli, you're going to wish you'd kept your hands to yourself." The fact that he knew my name, my full name, without anyone having told him, without having to ask or check with the manager, should have been the final warning I needed that I had stepped into something far deeper and far more dangerous than a simple assault, charge, or wrongful termination lawsuit. But by then it was too late. The wheels were already in motion. And as his men escorted me out of Carmelo's and into the night air that suddenly felt too cold against my wine-soaked skin, I realized with a clarity that was almost physically painful that my life as I had known it was over, and whatever came next would be entirely at the mercy of a man who looked like he had forgotten what mercy meant a very long time ago. 3 days later, they came for me, and when I say they came, I don't mean with guns blazing or dramatic threats shouted through my apartment door like you see in movies. That would have been kinder. would have at least given me something concrete to fight against, some clear enemy to rage at. But instead they came with documents, with lawyers in expensive suits, who smiled with all the warmth of sharks scenting blood in the water, and with a price tag attached to my moment of violence that I could never hope to pay in 1,000 lifetimes of serving overpriced pasta to people who treated me like furniture. The first sign that my world was collapsing had been the eviction notice slipped under my door on the morning after the incident, printed on official letterhead that looked legitimate enough to make my hands shake as I read the words explaining that my landlord had decided not to renew my month-to-month lease, that I had 30 days to vacate the premises, and that this decision was final and not subject to appeal or negotiation. I had lived in that cramped studio apartment for 3 years, had never been late with rent, had never caused problems or complaints, had been the kind of tenant that landlords typically loved because I was quiet and reliable and desperate enough that I would never risk losing my housing over something petty. But apparently none of that mattered when someone with enough money and influence decided they wanted you gone, wanted you scared, wanted you to understand that there was nowhere you could hide from the consequences of your actions. The second sign had come when I tried to access my bank account to pay for groceries, and discovered that my debit card had been declined, not because I was overdrawn, though my balance had never been impressive, but because my entire account had been frozen pending investigation into fraudulent activity. A claim so absurd it would have been laughable if it hadn't meant that I suddenly had no access to what little money I possessed, no way to buy food or pay bills, or do any of the 1,000 small things that required cash in a world that ran on transactions and exchanges. When I had called the bank, frantic and confused, demanding to know what fraudulent activity they were investigating, the customer service representative had been polite but unhelpful, explaining in that carefully neutral tone that people use when they're reading from a script that she couldn't discuss the details of an ongoing investigation, that these matters typically took several weeks to resolve, and that I should contact their fraud department during business hours if I had any questions or concerns about the hold on my account. By the time the lawyers had shown up at my door on the third day, I had already been reduced to a state of panicked uncertainty that made it difficult to think clearly, difficult to sleep, difficult to do anything except refresh my email obsessively in hopes of finding some explanation for why my entire life seemed to be systematically dismantled by invisible forces I couldn't identify or fight against. The lead attorney had been a woman named Constance Berkshire, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her severe expression, her briefcase probably worth more than everything I owned combined, and she had introduced herself with the kind of crisp professionalism that immediately made it clear this was not a social call, not a friendly chat, but rather the delivery of a verdict I had no power to appeal or contest. She had laid out the situation with brutal efficiency, explaining that her client, Vittoria Constantine, was pursuing legal action against me for assault and battery, for emotional distress, for defamation of character, and for about 6 other charges that blurred together in my panic-fogged brain as she recited them in that calm, matter-of-fact voice that people use when they're completely confident in their position, when they know they hold all the cards and you're playing with an empty hand. The estimated damages, she had informed me while sliding a document across my kitchen table that I was too shocked to actually read, totaled just over $300,000, a sum so astronomical that I had actually laughed out loud in sheer disbelief. Because what world did these people live in where they thought a waitress could possibly have access to that kind of money, where they believed that number represented anything other than a life sentence of debt and servitude? But Constance Berkshire had not been amused by my laughter, had simply waited for me to finish with that patient expression that suggested she had seen this reaction before, many times before, from other people who had made the mistake of crossing her clients and were now discovering that certain families operated entirely outside the normal bounds of law and consequences. She had then explained, in that same clinical tone, that her clients were not unreasonable people, that they understood I likely did not have the resources to pay the settlement outright, and that they were prepared to offer me an alternative arrangement that would satisfy the debt without requiring me to declare bankruptcy or face criminal charges that would almost certainly result in jail time, given the clear evidence of my assault against Mrs. Constantine in a public establishment with multiple witnesses. The alternative, as she had outlined it, had sounded simple enough on the surface. I would enter into a contract of service with the Constantine family, working off my debt through employment at one of their properties, with my wages and housing provided, but no additional compensation until the full amount of the settlement had been satisfied through my labor. The way she presented it had made it sound almost reasonable, almost generous even, like they were doing me a favor by offering me a way out of my impossible situation. But I had not survived 26 years on this earth, had not navigated the countless small cruelties and exploitations that came with being poor in a world designed for the wealthy, without developing some instinct for when I was being maneuvered into a trap disguised as salvation. I had asked, my voice barely above a whisper because my throat had gone tight with fear and rage and the horrible certainty that I had no real choice in any of this. What would happen if I refused their generous offer? If I chose instead to take my chances, with the legal system and whatever consequences that entailed? Constance had smiled then, a thin, utterly joyless expression that never reached her cold eyes, and had informed me that my refusal would be noted, and that her clients would proceed with both the civil suit and criminal charges, that they had already compiled extensive evidence, including security footage from the restaurant, witness statements from over a dozen patrons who had observed my violent outburst, and medical documentation of Mrs. Constantine's injuries, and that based on her experience with similar cases, I could expect to spend between 3 to 5 years in prison, followed by decades of wage garnishment to pay off the judgment that would inevitably be awarded against me. The choice, presented this way, had been no choice at all, had been instead a carefully constructed illusion of agency designed to make me feel like I was making a decision when in reality I was simply selecting which form of imprisonment I preferred, the literal kind behind bars, or the more subtle kind that came with being legally bound to people who had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy my life over a single slap, delivered in a moment of pushed too far desperation. I had signed the papers with hands that shook so badly I could barely hold the pen, my signature looking jagged and unsteady on the line that sealed my fate, and Constance had collected the documents with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had never once doubted the outcome of this meeting, who had known from the moment she walked through my door that I would sign, because people like me always did, because we had no resources, no connections, no powerful friends to call upon when the world decided to crush us beneath its indifferent heel. They had come for me that same afternoon, 2 of Damiano's men appearing at my door exactly 3 hours after Constance had left, giving me just enough time to throw a few essential belongings into a bag before they informed me, in tones that brooked no argument or delay, that it was time to leave, that my old life was over, and that I should not bother trying to contact anyone or make arrangements for my apartment, because all of that had already been handled by people far more efficient than I could ever hope to be. The drive to the Constantine estate had taken over an hour, carrying me away from the familiar streets of the city I had always known, and out into the countryside where estates like theirs existed behind high walls and electronic gates, hidden from the ordinary world like secrets that the wealthy preferred to keep locked away from prying eyes and moral judgments. The mansion itself had stolen what little breath remained in my lungs when the car had finally pulled through the gates and wound up a driveway lined with ancient oak trees that probably cost more to maintain than I had earned in my entire working life, revealing a structure that seemed to belong more to European aristocracy than to modern America, all stone and elegant architecture and windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun, like the eyes of some massive predator watching my approach with hungry interest. I had been escorted inside by the same 2 silent men who had collected me from my apartment, their hands never quite touching me but always positioned in ways that made it clear I was being guided rather than welcomed, that I was entering this beautiful prison as a captive rather than a guest, and that any thoughts I might have harbored about escape or resistance would be met with swift and certain consequences. The interior had been even more overwhelming than the exterior. All marble floors and soaring ceilings and artwork that I recognized from museum visits I had taken back when I still believed education and cultural knowledge might somehow lift me out of the poverty I had been born into. And I had felt profoundly out of place in my discount store clothes and scuffed shoes, like a stain on an otherwise perfect canvas. Like evidence of the real world intruding into this carefully constructed fantasy of wealth and power and privilege. They had led me through what felt like miles of corridors, past rooms whose purposes I could only guess at, until we had finally stopped before a set of heavy wooden doors that one of the men had knocked on, with the kind of deference that suggested whoever waited beyond commanded absolute respect and possibly absolute fear. The voice that had called for us to enter had been instantly recognizable despite the fact that I had only heard it once before, in that restaurant 3 nights ago when my world had begun its rapid descent into this nightmare, and I had felt my pulse spike with a fear so intense it bordered on panic as the doors swung open to reveal Damiano Constantine, seated behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of dark wood, his expression unreadable as those dark eyes fixed on me with the same unsettling intensity I remembered from our first encounter. He had dismissed his men with a slight gesture, waiting until they had retreated and closed the doors behind them before speaking, before rising from his chair and moving around the desk with a predatory grace that reminded me of big cats stalking prey, all controlled power and barely contained violence wrapped in expensive tailoring and civilized manners. He had welcomed me to his home with words that dripped with irony, explaining that I would be staying in the East Wing, that my duties would be outlined by his head of household, and that I was expected to comport myself with professionalism and respect at all times, as though I were the one who had engineered this entire situation, as though I had chosen to be here rather than been coerced through legal manipulation and financial terrorism. When I had finally found my voice, had finally managed to push words past the fear and rage that competed for dominance in my chest, I had asked him directly what he wanted from me, why he had gone to such elaborate lengths to bring me here, when he could have simply had me arrested or killed, or any of the other things that men in his position presumably did to people who crossed them. His answer had been delivered with a slight smile that never reached his eyes, a curving of lips that suggested he found my question amusing, in a way that made me feel like I was missing some crucial piece of information, some essential truth that would explain why I was standing in his study rather than rotting in a cell, or buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the woods beyond his estate. He had told me that Vittoria didn't know I was there, that my presence in his home was a surprise he had arranged for his wife, and that I would understand the purpose of this arrangement soon enough, that patience was a virtue I would need to cultivate if I hoped to survive my time in his household with my sanity and spirit intact. Before I could process that disturbing information, before I could ask the 1,000 questions that were crowding my mind and demanding answers, there had been a knock at the door, and another man had entered, younger than Damiano, but with the same air of casual violence held in careful check, his eyes assessing me with the kind of professional interest that suggested he was cataloging my weaknesses and potential uses with the efficiency of someone who had made a career out of reading people and exploiting what he found. Damiano had introduced him as Marco, his second in command, instructing him to show me to my quarters and explain the basic rules of the household, and Marco had nodded with the kind of easy obedience that spoke to years of working together, of understanding each other's methods and motivations without needing extensive explanation. As Marco had led me from the study and back through those endless corridors, he had spoken quietly, his voice pitched low enough that I had to strain to hear him over the sound of our footsteps echoing on marble floors, and what he had told me had sent ice flowing through my veins, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the windows we passed. He had warned me, in tones that suggested genuine concern rather than mere protocol, that the boss didn't do anything without being 3 moves ahead of everyone else, that whatever I thought was happening here was almost certainly not the full picture, and that if I wanted to survive this experience with anything resembling my former life intact, I would do well to watch, listen, and speak only when absolutely necessary. The room they had given me had been larger than my entire apartment, furnished with the kind of casual luxury that suggested money was simply not a consideration when designing spaces in this house. With windows that overlooked gardens so perfectly manicured they looked almost artificial in their geometric precision. And I had stood in the center of that beautiful cage, feeling more trapped than I had ever felt in my cramped studio, with its water-stained ceiling and radiator that only worked when it felt like it. Marco had left me there with instructions to rest, to unpack what few belongings I had brought, and to be ready at 7 o'clock for dinner, where I would be formally introduced to the household and where, he had added with a look that suggested he knew something I didn't and wasn't entirely comfortable with that knowledge, things would become considerably more complicated than they already were. I had spent the remaining hours until dinner pacing that luxurious room like an animal in a gilded cage, my mind racing through possibilities and scenarios, trying to understand why Damiano Constantine had gone to such lengths to bring me here, what purpose I could possibly serve in whatever game he was playing with his wife, and whether there was any way to escape this situation before it consumed me entirely. Through the windows, I had watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of fire and blood. And I had thought about that moment in the restaurant when my hand had connected with Vittoria's face, about how a single second of lost control had led me here, to this moment, to this place where I was completely at the mercy of people who viewed human beings as pieces to be moved around a board in games I couldn't even begin to understand. At exactly 7 o'clock, there had been a knock at my door, and one of the household staff, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle voice, had appeared to escort me to dinner, leading me through yet more corridors until we had reached a dining room that could have comfortably seated 30 people, but currently held only 3 place settings, arranged at one end of a table that stretched away into shadows, like a dark road leading to an uncertain destination. Damiano had been standing by the windows, his back to the room, his posture relaxed in a way that I already recognized as deceptive, as the calm before some storm I couldn't see approaching, but could feel building in the charged atmosphere of the room. And when he had turned at the sound of our entrance, I had seen something in his expression that made every instinct I possessed scream warnings about predators and prey, and the terrible vulnerability of being caught in the open with nowhere to run. He had been opening his mouth to speak, to welcome me or explain or do whatever it was he had planned for this moment, when another door had burst open with enough force to make me jump, and Vittoria Constantine had swept into the room like a force of nature, her hair perfect, her dress probably worth more than a car, her face already arranged in an expression of aristocratic boredom that suggested she was prepared to endure another tedious dinner with her husband before retreating to whatever separate life she maintained in this vast house. She had stopped mid-stride when she had seen me, her eyes going wide with recognition, and then narrowing with a hatred so pure and intense it was almost beautiful in its terrible focus, and the scream that had torn from her throat could have shattered crystal, could have broken glass, could have split the very air itself with the force of her rage and disbelief. The look she had turned on her husband then, the fury and betrayal written across every aristocratic feature, should have warned me that I had stepped into the middle of something far more dangerous than a simple revenge plot, that the dynamics between these two people were poisonous and volatile in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. But I had been too focused on the way Damiano had smiled at his wife's reaction, had been too captivated by the cold satisfaction in his eyes as he watched her lose control, to fully understand that I was not the target of whatever game he was playing, but rather the weapon he intended to use against someone he hated with the kind of intensity that only comes from years of intimate knowledge and accumulated grievances. When Vittoria had finally found words again, when she had managed to push past her shock and rage, to demand in a voice that shook with barely controlled violence, "What the hell I was doing in her home?" Damiano had answered, with a calmness that was somehow more terrifying than any shouting could have been, his words falling into the charged silence of the room like stones dropped into still water, each one creating ripples that promised to transform into waves that would sweep us all away. and what he said in that moment, the way he looked at me while speaking to his wife, made me realize with horrible clarity that I had not escaped one trap only to fall into another, but rather had been deliberately led from the frying pan into a fire that burned with a heat I was only beginning to understand. Vittoria's scream when she saw me, standing in her dining room, wearing clothes that had been provided by her husband's staff, and occupying space in the home she clearly considered her exclusive domain, could have shattered crystal, and probably did permanent damage to the eardrums of anyone unfortunate enough to be within 100 feet of her fury. But it was Damiano's smile that truly terrified me. The way his lips curved, with a satisfaction so complete and so cold that I understood in that moment that whatever was happening here had been orchestrated with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra through a symphony of destruction and chaos. She had advanced on me with murder in her eyes, her perfectly manicured hands curling into claws that suggested she would very much like to scratch out my eyes or wrap themselves around my throat. And I had instinctively stepped backward even though some part of me wanted to stand my ground, wanted to show her that I was not the same frightened waitress who had taken her abuse for 2 years before finally snapping. But Damiano had moved between us with a speed that belied his size, his hand catching his wife's wrist with a grip that must have been painful, based on the way her face contorted, and he had told her in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority that she would control herself in his presence, that violence was his purview and not hers, and that if she had complaints about his decisions regarding his household, she could voice them privately rather than making a scene in front of the staff. The look she had turned on him then had been venomous enough to kill a lesser man, filled with years of accumulated resentment and rage that clearly extended far beyond my unexpected presence in their home, and she had wrenched her wrist from his grasp with a violence that suggested their marriage was held together by something other than affection or mutual respect, perhaps by business arrangements or family obligations or the kind of strategic alliances that people like them entered into, without consulting something as irrelevant as love or genuine partnership. She had demanded to know, her voice shaking with an emotion that might have been fury or might have been something closer to fear. What possible reason he could have for bringing me into their home, for installing the woman who had assaulted her in a public restaurant into rooms that were mere corridors away from her own, for deliberately engineering a situation designed to humiliate and enrage her in front of their household staff and anyone else who might witness this confrontation. Damiano's answer had been delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he had been waiting for this moment, had been anticipating her reaction, and planning his response with the care that chess masters devoted to particularly satisfying gambits. And he had informed her in tones that dripped with barely concealed contempt that I was his acquisition, not hers, that he had entered into a legal contract regarding my services and my debt, and that where he chose to house his property was his decision alone and not subject to her approval or her hysterical objections. The way he had said property had made my skin crawl, had reminded me that whatever I thought my situation was, however I had rationalized signing those papers and entering into this arrangement, I was in fact owned by this man for the duration of my debt, bound to him legally and financially in ways that gave him power over nearly every aspect of my existence. Vittoria had laughed then, a sound without humor that echoed through the dining room like broken glass falling on marble, and she had told him that his pathetic attempts to provoke her were transparent and boring, that she knew exactly what he was doing and why, and that she refused to play whatever sick game he had concocted using this worthless girl as a pawn in their ongoing war. But even as she spoke, even as she dismissed the situation with words designed to convey indifference and superiority, I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together to hide the evidence of her distress, and I realized with a clarity that was almost revelatory that she was afraid, genuinely afraid of what her husband might do, of how far he might take this particular form of psychological warfare. Damiano had simply smiled again, that terrible curve of lips that promised nothing good, and had gestured toward the table with an invitation for us both to sit. to share dinner like civilized people rather than enemies circling each other, looking for weaknesses to exploit. And though every instinct I possessed screamed that I should refuse, should demand to be taken back to my room, or better yet released from this entire nightmare arrangement, I found myself moving toward the chair he indicated, because I was beginning to understand that in this house, in this world I had been dragged into, refusing Damiano Constantine was not an option that ended well for anyone foolish enough to attempt it. Vittoria had remained standing for a long moment, her eyes moving between her husband and me, with an expression that suggested she was performing calculations, weighing options, trying to determine the best strategy for navigating whatever trap he had set for her. And then she had moved to her own seat with the kind of rigid grace that came from years of deportment training and social conditioning. The dinner that followed had been one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life, a carefully choreographed exercise in tension and unspoken hostility, where every word carried multiple meanings, and every gesture seemed designed to convey messages I couldn't fully decode with my limited understanding of the complex dynamics between these two people, who were legally bound, but clearly despised each other with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Damiano had asked me questions about my background, my education, my family circumstances, all delivered in a tone of polite interest that would have seemed genuine if not for the way he watched his wife's reactions to my answers, the way he seemed to take particular pleasure in any detail that made Vittoria's jaw tighten, or her fingers grip her wineglass with enough force to risk shattering the delicate crystal. When he had asked about my mother's illness, about the medical bills that had consumed my savings and forced me into longer hours at jobs that paid barely enough to survive, Vittoria had made a small sound of contempt, a dismissive noise that suggested such concerns were beneath her notice, that people who allowed themselves to fall into poverty through lack of resources or connections deserved whatever suffering befell them. And I had felt anger spike hot and fierce in my chest before Damiano had reached across the table to refill my wineglass, his fingers brushing against mine in a contact that lasted a fraction of a second too long to be accidental. And the look he had given me then had been complex enough that I couldn't begin to untangle all the meanings woven through it. He had turned to his wife then, his voice taking on a quality of false concern as he asked whether she was feeling well, whether perhaps the stress of recent events had affected her appetite since she had barely touched the exquisite food that had been prepared by their clearly talented kitchen staff. And Vittoria had responded with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, assuring him that she was perfectly fine, that her appetite remained unaffected by his juvenile attempts at provocation, and that she found the entire situation more pathetic than upsetting. But the way her hands trembled as she lifted her wineglass to her lips, the way color had risen in her cheeks despite her attempts to maintain an air of bored superiority, suggested that his campaign of psychological warfare was having exactly the effect he desired, that each small humiliation was landing with precision on targets he had spent years learning to identify and exploit. As the meal progressed, and the wine flowed more freely, loosening tongues and lowering the careful guards that people in their position typically maintained, I began to understand that their marriage was not merely loveless, but actively hostile. A strategic alliance between powerful families that had soured into something toxic and potentially dangerous, where every interaction was a battle, and every conversation was loaded with the accumulated grievances of years spent trapped in a relationship neither wanted, but neither could escape. Vittoria had mentioned business dealings that Damiano had apparently mishandled, investments that had failed to yield expected returns, and he had countered with references to her family's declining influence, to scandals that had been suppressed but not forgotten, to failures and embarrassments that clearly struck nerves based on the way her face flushed with rage. Through it all, I sat silently, trying to make myself as invisible as possible while simultaneously trying to understand the complex game being played around me, trying to figure out what role Damiano expected me to play in his obvious campaign to torment his wife, and whether there was any way to navigate this situation without being completely destroyed by the fallout. It was only when dessert had been served, when the staff had retreated and left us alone in that cavernous dining room, that Damiano had finally addressed the obvious question hanging in the air like smoke, turning to me with an expression of almost friendly curiosity as he asked whether I understood why I was there, whether I had puzzled out the purpose of my presence in his household beyond simply working off a debt that we both knew had been artificially inflated to serve his purposes. I had wanted to tell him that I understood nothing, that I was completely lost in a world of power plays and martial warfare that I had no training or preparation for, that I was terrified and confused and desperate for some clarity about what was expected of me. But the words that had actually emerged from my mouth had been more honest than I intended, more revealing of the anger and resentment that simmered beneath my fear, and I had told him that I understood he was using me as a weapon against his wife, that I was a tool in whatever sick game they were playing with each other, and that I resented being reduced to a pawn in conflicts I had no stake in and no understanding of. The silence that followed my words had been absolute and terrifying, stretching out for seconds that felt like hours, while Damiano studied me with those dark, unreadable eyes, and I had braced myself for violence or rage or some form of punishment for speaking so directly to a man who clearly expected deference and obedience from those he considered beneath him. But instead of anger, his expression had shifted into something that looked almost like approval, like satisfaction that I had demonstrated some spark of intelligence or courage, or perhaps just the kind of reckless honesty that he found refreshing in a world where everyone around him presumably spoke in carefully calculated half-truths, designed to avoid offense. He had told me then, his voice dropping to a tone that suggested he was sharing a confidence, that he had seen fire in me when I slapped his wife, the kind of genuine passion and fury that he hadn't witnessed in years of dealing with people who were too afraid or too calculating to show real emotion, and that quality had interested him, had made him wonder what other buttons might be pushed, what other reactions might be provoked, what uses such a person might have in his increasingly stagnant and predictable existence. Vittoria had stood abruptly at these words, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound, like a scream, and she had announced in a voice that shook with barely controlled rage that she refused to sit there and listen to her husband wax poetic about the virtues of some common trash who had attacked her, that she was retiring to her rooms, and that she expected this situation to be resolved quickly and permanently. But Damiano had raised one hand in a gesture that froze her mid-turn, a simple movement that somehow carried enough authority to stop her in her tracks, and he had informed her in tones that allowed no argument that I would be staying indefinitely, that she would treat me with the basic courtesy she extended to other members of the household staff, and that any attempts to harm or harass me would be considered a personal insult to him and dealt with accordingly. The implications of that statement, the suggestion that he was claiming some kind of protection over me, had clearly not been lost on Vittoria, whose face had cycled through expressions of disbelief, fury, and something that looked disturbingly like calculation before she had turned on her heel and stalked from the room with the kind of dramatic exit that suggested she had practice making them. Alone with Damiano in that vast dining room, surrounded by the remnants of our meal and the weight of all that had been said and left unsaid, I had felt the atmosphere shift in ways that made my skin prickle with awareness, with the kind of dangerous attraction that I knew I should resist but found myself drawn to despite every rational argument against it. He had risen from his seat and moved around the table toward me with that predatory grace I was beginning to recognize as fundamental to his nature, and when he had extended his hand to help me from my chair, the contact had sent electricity racing through my nerves in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the kind of raw physical attraction that overrides common sense and self-preservation. The conversation that followed, conducted in low voices as he walked me through the darkened corridors toward my room, had revealed aspects of his situation that I hadn't previously understood, details about the arranged nature of his marriage, about the business alliance it represented between his family's operations and Vittoria's father's organization, about the cage he found himself trapped in, despite all his power and wealth and influence. He had spoken with a bitterness that seemed genuine, describing years of maintaining appearances, of pretending to a partnership that had never existed, of slowly growing to hate the woman he was bound to through vows neither of them had entered into willingly or with any expectation of actual affection. When we had reached my door, when the moment had come for him to leave me to whatever uneasy rest I might manage in this strange and dangerous place, he had paused, with his hand on the frame, his body close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the expensive cologne that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. And he had told me in a voice rough with emotion I couldn't fully identify that I was the first real thing he had wanted in a decade, the first person who had stirred something in him, beyond the cold calculation and strategic thinking that had become second nature during years of operating in a world where everything was transactional and nothing was offered without expecting something in return. The kiss that followed had been inevitable from the moment he had stepped into my space, from the moment his hand had come up to cup my face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything I knew about him. And when his lips had met mine, I had felt the world tilt and reform around that point of contact, felt every rational objection and self-protective instinct dissolve beneath the onslaught of sensation and want and the kind of reckless desire that makes people do catastrophically stupid things. His hands had found my waist, pulling me against him with a possessiveness that should have alarmed me but instead ignited something primal and dangerous in my core. And I had kissed him back with all the pent-up frustration and fear and anger of the past days, channeling everything into that contact, into the slide of lips and tongue, and the barely controlled violence of mutual wanting. When we had finally broken apart, both breathing hard, both clearly affected by what had just happened, he had looked at me with eyes that burned with an intensity that made me feel like I was standing at the edge of a precipice, about to make a choice that would determine the entire trajectory of my future. And he had asked in a voice that was almost vulnerable, almost uncertain, whether I felt it too. This thing between us that defied logic and common sense and every rule that should have kept us in our separate worlds. I had wanted to lie, to deny the attraction that pulsed between us like a living thing, to protect myself from the inevitable disaster that would follow if I admitted to feelings for a married man, a dangerous man, a man who held my life in his hands through legal contracts and financial manipulation. But the truth had spilled from my lips before I could stop it. A confession that yes, I felt it too. Felt it so intensely it terrified me. Felt it in ways that made me question my own sanity and self-preservation instincts. He had smiled then. A real smile that transformed his face from coldly handsome to devastating. And he had traced the line of my jaw with fingers that trembled slightly, betraying an emotion he typically kept locked behind walls of control and calculated distance, before forcing himself to step back, to put necessary space between us, to acknowledge that whatever this was, whatever was developing in the charged air between our bodies, it would have consequences that we needed to consider carefully before proceeding. As he had walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silent corridor, I had leaned against my doorframe feeling like I had just survived something intense and transformative, like the world had shifted on its axis, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Sleep, when it finally came in the early hours of morning, had been restless, and filled with dreams that blurred the line between desire and danger, between the thrill of attraction and the terror of consequences. And when I had woken to find expensive clothes laid out for me, and a note in Damiano's handwriting requesting my presence at breakfast, I had understood that the previous night had been a beginning, rather than an aberration, that we had crossed some invisible line that could not be uncrossed, and that whatever came next would test every assumption I had ever made about myself, my values, and my ability to survive in a world where power and desire mixed into cocktails toxic enough to destroy everyone they touched. But what I had not anticipated, what I could not have prepared for even if someone had explicitly warned me, was that Vittoria had been watching, had been gathering evidence, had been waiting for exactly this kind of mistake from her husband, so that she could spring whatever trap she had been preparing since the moment she realized I posed a threat not just to her pride, but to the carefully maintained fiction of her marriage and the power it represented. The revelation came during breakfast, delivered by Marco, who had appeared with an expression that mixed concern and professional distance, informing Damiano in tones carefully pitched to avoid being overheard by listening staff that his wife had requested a meeting with the heads of both families, that she had made certain allegations regarding his conduct, and that the situation was escalating in ways that required immediate attention and strategic response. The look Damiano had given me across the breakfast table, filled with regret and calculation and something that might have been genuine concern for my safety, had told me everything I needed to know about how serious this development was, about how the game we had been playing with such reckless abandon had suddenly become deadly serious, and that Vittoria's revenge for my slap, for my presence in her home, for the threat I represented to her position, was going to be far more comprehensive and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined possible. I should have known that Vittoria wouldn't let the humiliation stand, should have anticipated that a woman who had spent her entire life wielding power like a weapon and using her position to crush anyone who dared challenge her would never simply accept being outmaneuvered in her own home by a husband she clearly despised, and a waitress she considered beneath contempt. Because women like her didn't just get even through petty acts of revenge. They destroyed. They annihilated. They made examples out of people who crossed them so that no one would ever dare make the same mistake again. The attack came 3 days after that charged breakfast, where Marco had delivered his warning. 3 days during which I had moved through the Constantine estate like a ghost haunting rooms I had no right to occupy, hyper-aware of Vittoria's cold eyes tracking my movements whenever our paths crossed, of the way conversations would die when I entered a room, of the oppressive sense that something terrible was building in the spaces between moments, gathering force like a storm that would eventually break over all our heads with devastating consequences. I had been walking back to my room from the library where I had spent the afternoon, trying to lose myself in books and forget about the impossible situation I had fallen into, trying to ignore the way my body still remembered Damiano's touch, and my mind kept replaying that kiss in the corridor, when 3 men had emerged from a service hallway with faces I didn't recognize and intentions that were immediately, horrifyingly clear in the way they spread out to block my path and prevent any possibility of escape. The first man had grabbed my arm with bruising force, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to leave marks that would linger for days, and I had opened my mouth to scream for help, to alert someone to what was happening, when his partner had clamped a hand over my face, cutting off my air and my voice while the third man produced a knife that caught the light from the corridor's chandelier and reflected it back in ways that made my vision blur with terror and desperate animal panic. They had dragged me toward a door I had never noticed before, one that clearly led to some forgotten part of the estate where screams wouldn't carry, and violence could be conducted without interruption. And I had fought with everything I had, kicking and clawing and trying to bite the hand that covered my mouth, driven by a primal understanding that if they got me through that door, if they succeeded in taking me to whatever isolated location they had planned, I would not emerge alive or intact. The sound of gunfire had been so unexpected, so shocking in its proximity and violence, that for a moment I had thought I had been shot, that the burning pain in my chest was a bullet rather than pure terror. But then the hand over my mouth had gone slack, and the man holding me had collapsed, his body suddenly dead weight pulling me down with him, and I had looked up through tears and panic to see Damiano standing at the end of the corridor with a gun still raised, his face transformed into something I had never seen before, something primal and terrifying that made the careful businessman and sophisticated criminal I had come to know seem like a mask he wore over this truer, darker self. The other 2 men had tried to run, had made it perhaps 10 steps before more shots rang out, before they crumpled to the expensive carpet that was now decorated with spreading pools of blood, and I had watched with a detachment born of shock as Damiano approached with measured steps, his eyes never leaving my face as he holstered his weapon and knelt beside where I had fallen against the wall, my legs no longer capable of supporting my weight. His hands had been gentle as he checked me for injuries, as he carefully examined the bruises already forming on my arms and the scratch across my cheek where one of the attackers had caught me with rough fingers and when he had finally seemed satisfied that I was hurt, but not seriously damaged, he had pulled me against his chest with a fierceness that bordered on desperation, his arms wrapping around me like he could shield me from the violence he himself had just committed, from the reality of the world we both inhabited, where life was cheap, and revenge was a currency more valuable than gold. I had felt the rapid pounding of his heart against my ear, had realized that beneath the cold control he projected to the world, he was genuinely shaken, genuinely affected by how close I had come to being hurt, or killed, or worse, and that realization had cracked something open inside my chest, had let in feelings I had been desperately trying to keep at bay because acknowledging them meant accepting just how completely I had fallen for a man who represented everything dangerous and impossible in my life. He had carried me to his private quarters, bypassing my assigned room and the possibility of running into staff or family members who might have questions about the bodies in the corridor and the blood that stained my clothes and his hands, and in that sanctuary of dark wood and leather furniture that smelled like expensive whiskey and his cologne. He had tended to my wounds with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had just killed 3 men without hesitation or apparent remorse. The silence between us had been thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of what had almost happened and what had definitely shifted between us. And when he had finally finished cleaning the scratch on my face and had pressed a glass of amber liquid into my shaking hands, he had knelt before me like a supplicant before a queen, and had told me in a voice rough with emotion that he was sorry, that he had underestimated Vittoria's willingness to escalate their private war, that he should have anticipated she would try something this direct and this violent. The confession that followed had poured out of him like water from a broken dam, years of frustration and loneliness, and being trapped in a life he had never wanted with a woman he had grown to hate, bound by obligations to families and business arrangements that cared nothing for his happiness or desires, and somewhere in the midst of that raw honesty, somewhere between his admission that seeing me in danger had terrified him, in ways he hadn't felt since childhood, and his declaration that I was the first person in a decade who had made him want something beyond power and revenge, we had crossed the final line that had been straining between us since that first kiss. The passion that ignited between us had been desperate and intense, fueled by adrenaline and near-death terror, and the kind of connection that forms when 2 people recognize in each other a matching brokenness, a similar hunger for something real in a world built on lies and strategic alliances. And when we had finally collapsed together in his massive bed, tangled in sheets that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, I had felt simultaneously more alive and more doomed than at any previous point in my chaotic existence. The morning had brought Marco and news that made my blood run cold, despite the warmth of Damiano's body still pressed against mine, because Vittoria had apparently been waiting for exactly this development, had positioned herself to capture evidence of our affair through means I didn't fully understand but that Marco explained with the grim efficiency of someone delivering a death sentence. She had photographs, had audio recordings, had compiled a comprehensive dossier documenting every interaction between her husband and me, and she was preparing to present this evidence to both families, Damiano's Italian Mafia connections and her own Russian Bratva relatives, with an ultimatum that would force him to choose between me and the empire he had spent his adult life building and maintaining. The power dynamics of the situation had been explained to me with brutal clarity as I sat wrapped in Damiano's shirt while he paced his bedroom like a caged predator, Marco's voice outlining the consequences of refusing Vittoria's demands versus the consequences of compliance, and I had realized, with a sinking sensation in my stomach, that my presence had not just complicated their marriage, but had threatened to destabilize an entire criminal infrastructure built on alliances and agreements that treated people like commodities and love like a weakness to be exploited. Vittoria's message had been delivered through Marco with the kind of cold precision I had come to associate with her brand of cruelty, informing Damiano that he had 24 hours to kill me himself, to prove his loyalty to their arrangement and their families, or she would release her evidence and trigger a war between organizations that would leave bodies stacked like cordwood and empires burning, while she emerged with her reputation intact. and his in ruins. The look Damiano had given me when Marco finished delivering this ultimatum had been filled with such complex emotion that I couldn't begin to untangle all the threads, rage and calculation and something that looked heartbreakingly like genuine anguish. And I had understood in that moment that I was going to die, that whatever feelings had developed between us were not enough to overcome the weight of obligation and strategic necessity that governed his world, and that my punishment for slapping Vittoria Constantine and daring to reach above my station was going to be a bullet from the man I had been foolish enough to fall for. When Damiano came to my room with a gun tucked into his waistband, and Marco trailing behind him, with an expression that mixed professional detachment with what might have been genuine regret, I thought I knew exactly how this story ended. Thought I had finally reached the conclusion that had been inevitable. From the moment my hand connected with Vittoria's face in that restaurant. But I was wrong about so many things. Wrong about the game being played, and the pieces on the board, and most especially wrong about who the real target of Damiano's carefully orchestrated revenge had been all along. He had told me to come with him in a voice devoid of emotion, the same flat tone I imagined he used when conducting business that required violence and permanent solutions. And I had followed without protest because some part of me had accepted that this was always how it would end, that women like me didn't get to walk away from situations like this, didn't get happy endings or last-minute rescues, and that perhaps dying by his hand was preferable to whatever slow destruction Vittoria would engineer if given the opportunity. The drive had taken us to a warehouse on the outskirts of the estate, one of those vast industrial spaces that existed in the gray areas of legitimate business and criminal enterprise. And as we had pulled through the loading bay doors into the dim interior lit by bare bulbs hanging from chains, I had seen that we were not alone, that the space was filled with people I didn't recognize. Hard-faced men in expensive suits who radiated the kind of casual menace that came from lives spent enforcing rules through violence and intimidation. What I had not expected, what had stolen the breath from my lungs and made my mind race to catch up with a reality that defied everything I thought I understood about my situation, was the sight of Vittoria Constantine bound to a chair in the center of that warehouse floor, her perfect hair disheveled and her designer clothes torn, her face a mask of rage and terror that transformed her beauty into something ugly and desperate. The men surrounding her were clearly representatives of both families, based on the territorial way they had positioned themselves on opposite sides of the space, creating a divided audience for whatever performance Damiano had orchestrated. And when he had walked me past his wife's chair, when she had looked up at me with hatred so pure it should have been lethal, I had felt the narrative I had constructed about my impending death shatter and reform into something I couldn't yet fully comprehend. Damiano had positioned me beside him at what was clearly the head of this impromptu gathering, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back as he began to speak, his voice carrying through the warehouse with the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to command attention and obedience. And what he revealed in the next minutes had rewritten everything I thought I knew about the past weeks, had exposed layers of deception and strategy that made my earlier understanding seem childishly simple. He had told the assembled representatives of both criminal families that his wife had been systematically embezzling from their joint operations for the better part of 2 years, skimming profits and redirecting funds into accounts that would have allowed her to disappear with enough money to live comfortably, while both organizations tore each other apart in recriminations and accusations over the missing millions. The evidence he presented had been comprehensive and damning. Documents and financial records and recordings of Vittoria discussing her plans with associates who had already been quietly eliminated, and as the full scope of her betrayal unfolded in his measured recitation of facts and figures. I had watched her face cycle through denial and defiance before settling into a kind of desperate calculation that suggested she was still searching for an escape route from the trap that had closed around her. But the revelation that had truly shocked me, that had made me understand the full extent of Damiano's manipulation and planning, was when he explained that Vittoria had also been arranging his assassination, had hired contractors to make it look like a rival organization's attack, had been prepared to play the grieving widow while consolidating power and wealth in the chaos that would follow his death. He had known about her plans for months. He explained to the increasingly hostile crowd of family representatives, had been gathering evidence and building his case with the patience of someone who understood that rushing to judgment would only result in his own destruction. And then he had turned to look at me with an expression that mixed triumph and something that looked almost like apology as he revealed the final, stunning piece of his strategy. The night at the restaurant, my employment at Carmelo's, even Vittoria's decision to dine there that evening, all of it had been orchestrated by him, carefully arranged to create the exact confrontation that had resulted in my slapping his wife, because he had researched me for weeks before that night, had identified me as someone with nothing to lose, someone with exactly the right combination of desperation and fire that would make me perfect for his purposes. He had needed someone Vittoria would target, someone she would underestimate and attempt to destroy, someone whose presence would make her sloppy and desperate enough to reveal her true intentions and her carefully hidden betrayals. And I had played my role perfectly, without ever knowing I was performing in his elaborately staged production. The slap that had started everything, the moment I thought had been my downfall, had actually been the beginning of Vittoria's end. The first domino in a chain of events designed to expose her crimes and give Damiano the justification he needed to eliminate her without triggering the family war that her father's organization would have demanded if he had simply killed her without cause. The judgment delivered by the assembled family representatives had been swift and brutal. Vittoria's own father stepping forward to publicly disown her, to strip her of her name and protection, to declare her outside the bounds of family loyalty, and therefore subject to whatever consequences Damiano deemed appropriate for her betrayal. I had expected him to kill her then, to end this elaborate revenge with a bullet between her eyes. But what he did instead was somehow more cruel and more perfect, stripping her of everything that had given her power and identity, her money, her connections, her status, and condemning her to the kind of life she had always looked down upon with contempt, the life of working in restaurants and taking orders from people she considered beneath her, of being invisible and powerless and utterly dependent on the mercy of employers who would show her exactly as much consideration as she had shown people like me. When Damiano had finally turned to me, when the warehouse had emptied and we were left alone except for Marco standing respectfully distant, he had offered me a choice with an honesty that felt genuine despite everything I now knew about his capacity for manipulation and long-term strategic thinking. I could walk away with enough money to disappear, to start over somewhere he would never find me, to build a life free from the danger and moral compromise that came with his world, or I could stay as his equal, his partner, his queen in the empire he was rebuilding, without the weight of an unwanted wife and toxic alliance dragging him down. The decision should have been obvious, should have sent me running toward freedom and safety and the kind of normal life where people didn't solve problems with violence and elaborate revenge plots. But as I stood there looking into Damiano's dark eyes, seeing the hope and vulnerability he was allowing me to witness beneath his carefully constructed armor, I realized that somewhere in the chaos of the past weeks, I had fallen completely and irrevocably for this dangerous, complicated man who had used me but had also saved me, who had manipulated me but had also shown me a world where I could be something more than invisible. I had told him, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was choosing, that I had slapped my way into this life and I wasn't walking away now, that whatever came next, whatever challenges and dangers awaited in the world he inhabited, I wanted to face them beside him, rather than spend the rest of my existence wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to reach for something extraordinary instead of settling for safe mediocrity. The kiss he had given me then had been different from the desperate passion of our first encounters, filled instead with promise and partnership, and the kind of profound relief that comes from finding someone who sees you completely, darkness and light together, and chooses to stay anyway. 6 months later, standing beside Damiano as we surveyed the rebuilt empire we had constructed together from the ashes of old alliances and toxic partnerships, I sometimes thought about that moment in Carmelo's when my hand connected with Vittoria's face, about how a single second of lost control had led me here, to a life I could never have imagined, and a love I had never thought to find. The waitress had become the queen, and the queen had become the servant. And in the strange alchemy of revenge and desire and strategic violence, I had discovered that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what everyone tells you is impossible. Reach above your station, claim what you want, and refuse to apologize for the chaos you create in pursuit of a life that feels real, even if that reality is built on foundations that would make ordinary people run screaming into the safety of their predictable, powerless existences. Because at least when I closed my eyes at night in Damiano's arms, I knew that every choice that brought me here had been mine, even the ones I made without knowing I was choosing. And that kind of ownership over your own destruction and reconstruction is worth more than 1,000 safe, forgettable lives lived in the shadows of other people's stories.